On the morning of June 14th, 2000, at approximately 10:30 a.m., a 73-year-old man arrived at the Tampa International Airport Hilton Hotel carrying the weight of 25 years of secrets. His name was George Vladimirovich Trofimoff. He was a retired colonel in the United States Army Reserve, a naturalized American citizen, and, according to federal prosecutors, the highest-ranking military officer in American history to betray his adopted country to the Soviet Union. His wife, Yuta, sat waiting in their car in the parking lot, unaware that within minutes FBI agents would emerge from the hotel room where her husband had gone to meet a man he believed was a Russian intelligence officer. The man was Special Agent Dmitry Drujinsky, and the meeting would end with Trofimoff in handcuffs, facing charges that would send him to prison for the remainder of his life. Trofimoff had come to the hotel believing he was about to receive $20,000 in cash from the Russian government, money he desperately needed to pay off mounting debts that had reduced him to bagging groceries part-time at a public supermarket in Melbourne, Florida. What he did not know was that every word of his previous meetings with the man calling himself Igor Galkin had been recorded on videotape containing his own voice, describing in detail how he had, for more than 2 decades, smuggled classified documents out of one of NATO's most sensitive intelligence facilities, photographed them in his home, and passed the film to Soviet handlers in exchange for cash. What he did not know was that a defector named Vasily Mitrokhin had, 8 years earlier, carried thousands of pages of KGB records out of Russia, records that included details about an American spy, codenamed _0_, who had provided the Soviets with classified intelligence exceeding 50,000 pages over a quarter-century. The arrest that morning in Tampa marked the end of one of the longest-running espionage operations in Cold War history, and the beginning of attempts to understand how and why an American intelligence officer had betrayed the country he had sworn to serve. George Vladimirovich Trofimoff was born on March 9, 1927, in Berlin, Germany, into a world of displaced Russian aristocracy and unresolved trauma. His father, Vladimir Vladimirovich Trofimoff, had attended the Page Corps Military Academy in Imperial Russia and served as a major in the anti-communist White Army during the Russian Civil War. His mother, Ekaterina Kartali, had been a successful concert pianist before marrying Major Trofimoff in 1926. George's paternal grandfather, Vladimir Ivanovich Trofimoff, a brigadier general in the Imperial Russian Army General Staff, had been arrested and shot by the Cheka in 1919. The family's experience of the Bolshevik Revolution was immediate, violent, and had destroyed everything they had known. When Ekaterina died in 1928, just over a year after George's birth, Major Trofimoff descended into abject poverty. Unable to care for his young son, Vladimir temporarily sent George to be raised by Vladimir and Antonina Sharavov, fellow White Russian émigrés living in Berlin. Antonina had a son from a previous marriage, a boy named Igor Vladimirovich Susemil, who was 8 years older than George. The two boys grew up together, and George would continue to refer to Igor as his brother for the rest of his life. In 1943, when George was 16, Vladimir Trofimoff remarried, and George moved back in with his father and new stepmother. But the family was soon separated again due to Allied bombing raids on Berlin. They would not see each other again until 1949. In the fall of 1944, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and Allied forces from the west, 17-year-old George Trofimoff received orders to report for conscription into the German army. He had no desire to fight for a country that was not his own in a war that was clearly lost. Rather than comply, he fled to occupied Czechoslovakia, and remained in hiding near Pilsen until the end of the Second World War in May 1945. When the war ended, Trofimoff emerged from hiding and fled the advancing Soviet army into the American zone of occupied Germany. His grandfather had been executed by the Bolsheviks. His family had lost everything in the revolution. The last thing he wanted was to fall under Soviet control. Working as an interpreter for the United States Army, Trofimoff made his way illegally to Paris in 1946. There he was embraced by the city's community of white Russian émigrés, many of whom had known his father and grandfather. Through these connections, Trofimoff was sponsored by the Society of Friends for Emigration to the United States. In December 1947, at the age of 20, he boarded a KLM Royal Dutch airliner in Amsterdam and flew to New York City, arriving in America with little money, no family, and fluency in Russian, German, and English. Trofimoff enlisted in the United States Army in 1948. 3 years later, in 1951, he became a naturalized American citizen. In 1953, he received a commission in the United States Army Reserve and was honorably discharged from active duty in 1956 after 3 years of service. But his career in military intelligence was just beginning. In 1959, Trofimoff was hired as a civilian employee in Army intelligence. His fluency in Russian and German, combined with his personal knowledge of Eastern European culture and his status as someone who had fled communist control, made him valuable to American intelligence operations. Over the next decade, Trofimoff obtained positions of increasing responsibility within the U.S. Army intelligence community, including work with the 66th Military Intelligence Group. In 1969, he was promoted to chief of the U.S. Army element at the Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center in West Germany. He was 42 years old. The Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center was a NATO facility administered jointly by German, British, French, and American intelligence officers. Its purpose was to debrief defectors, refugees, and other individuals who had fled from the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries. These defectors brought information about military capabilities, political structures, scientific developments, and intelligence operations behind the Iron Curtain. The center maintained extensive classified files on Soviet and Warsaw Pact military orders of battle detailing the organization, equipment, and positioning of enemy forces. It also collected information on NATO's own intelligence priorities, gaps in knowledge, and operational methods. As chief of the U.S. Army element with top-secret security clearance, Trofimoff had virtually unlimited access to everything that passed through the facility. According to testimony presented years later at his trial, it was easier for Trofimoff to remove a classified document from the Joint Interrogation Center than it would have been for an ordinary citizen to check out a book from a public library. The only thing preventing the theft of classified material was trust. Trofimoff lived in Nuremberg with his wife and worked at the center 5 days a week. By all outward appearances, he was a dedicated and competent intelligence officer who spoke fluent Russian and German with native proficiency, understood the culture and psychology of the defectors, and had credibility with his colleagues and superiors. He had access to NATO's secrets, and according to federal prosecutors, beginning in 1969, he began systematically betraying every piece of classified information he could get his hands on. The man who recruited George Trofimoff into the service of the KGB was the person he still called his brother. Igor Vladimirovich Susemil had followed a very different path from George after their childhood together in Berlin. While George had fled to the West and eventually made his way to America, Igor had remained in Germany and entered the Russian Orthodox Church. In 1942, at the age of 23, he was ordained a deacon by the Moscow Patriarchate. He received an ecclesiastical divorce from his first wife, was tonsured as a monk, and became a hieromonk of the Russian Orthodox Church. By 1966, he had risen to auxiliary bishop of Munich and West Germany. In 1972, he was consecrated as Metropolitan of Vienna and all Austria, taking the religious name Irene. During the Cold War, the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church was deeply penetrated by the KGB. This was documented fact, confirmed by defectors, declassified documents, and later by church officials themselves. Not every Orthodox clergyman was a KGB agent. But every bishop and metropolitan who held significant positions within the Moscow Patriarchate had to be approved by Soviet authorities. Many actively worked for Soviet intelligence. Metropolitan Irene was one of them. When Trofimoff arrived in Germany in 1969 to take up his position at the Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center, he renewed his relationship with Igor. The two men had not seen each other in more than 2 decades. Igor was now Metropolitan Irene, based in Vienna, Austria, about 150 miles southeast of Nuremberg. George was now an American Army officer with access to NATO's most sensitive intelligence. According to the federal indictment filed against Trofimoff 3 decades later, Metropolitan Irene learned that his foster brother was chronically short of funds and recruited him into the service of the KGB. The recruitment followed a pattern that KGB officers understood well. Financial pressure created vulnerability. Personal relationships created trust. Ideology may have played some role. Trofimoff's family had been destroyed by the Bolsheviks, yet he also retained a Russian identity that had never fully Americanized. But according to Trofimoff's own later statements, the primary motivation was money. He was living beyond his means with expensive tastes and turbulent personal relationships. He went through 5 wives over the course of his life, with one wife being just 18 years old when he married her while he was in his 50s. He bought sports cars he could not afford and entertained lavishly. Metropolitan Irene offered him a solution to his financial problems, and he accepted. The operational method was simple but effective. Trofimoff would bring classified documents home from the Joint Interrogation Center. The KGB provided him with a special camera and tripod designed for photographing documents. He would photograph the materials in his home, then return the originals to the center the next day. No one noticed. The security system at the facility relied on trust rather than physical controls, and as chief of the American element, no one questioned what he was doing. The film from the camera was passed to KGB handlers during regular meetings in Austria. Sometimes Trofimoff met with Metropolitan Irene personally, sometimes with other KGB operatives who worked under various covers. The meetings took place in Vienna, Bad Ischl, and other locations in Austria, which was neutral territory during the Cold War and therefore safer for intelligence operations than West Germany. According to former KGB General Oleg Kalugin, who would later testify about the case, Trofimoff always received his payments from Metropolitan Irene, not directly from other KGB officers. The payments were substantial. Metropolitan Irene paid Trofimoff approximately 7,000 Deutschmarks per month in used bills. When Trofimoff needed a larger sum for a down payment on a house, Metropolitan Irene went to his contacts in Moscow and returned with 90,000 Deutschmarks, approximately $40,000 in American currency at the time. The money allowed Trofimoff to maintain his desired lifestyle: nice cars, good wine, social entertaining, the appearance of success. In exchange, he gave the KGB everything that passed through the Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center. Records later compiled by KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin indicated that the classified materials provided by the spy codenamed Marquise exceeded 50,000 pages over 25 years. The information included the testimony of Eastern Bloc defectors, allowing Soviet intelligence to identify who had defected and what they had revealed. It included NATO order of battle documents detailing the organization and capabilities of Western military forces. It included information about American and NATO intelligence gaps, priorities, and collection methods. Every defector who spoke to American intelligence at the Nuremberg Center was potentially compromised. Every intelligence priority was revealed. Every operational method was exposed. General Kalugin would later testify that during the 1970s, Trofimoff was ranked at the top of the KGB's list of American intelligence assets, one of their most valuable spies. In 1978, as recognition for his work, the Soviet Union awarded Trofimoff the Order of the Red Banner, which Kalugin described as the USSR's highest military award for meritorious and dangerous service. Kalugin also testified that he had personally invited Metropolitan Irene to visit his dacha in 1978 to thank him, telling the Metropolitan, "He did good work, particularly in recruiting Marquise. I wanted to thank him for what he had done." For years, the operation ran without a hitch. Trofimoff continued working at the Joint Interrogation Center, maintaining his top-secret security clearance and rising to chief of the facility. Metropolitan Irene continued serving the Russian Orthodox Church while simultaneously serving Soviet intelligence. The money flowed. The documents flowed. No one suspected. Then, in 1987, Metropolitan Irene told Trofimoff to stop. According to Trofimoff's later account, the Metropolitan ordered him to destroy the camera used for photographing documents, and Trofimoff said he smashed it with a hammer and threw it away. The reason for the order is not entirely clear from the public record, but 1987 was the year Mikhail Gorbachev was pursuing glasnost and perestroika, and Soviet intelligence operations worldwide were being reassessed. However, according to federal prosecutors, Trofimoff did not actually stop. Despite the Metropolitan's order, he continued removing and photographing documents for 7 more years. Trofimoff retired from the United States Army Reserve with the rank of colonel in 1987. He continued his civilian position at the interrogation center until 1994, when he finally retired after 35 years of service. By then, he and his 5th wife, Yuta, had moved to Melbourne, Florida, settling into a home on Patriot Drive in an exclusive gated military retirement community. They lived quietly. Trofimoff was in his late 60s. His espionage career, as far as he knew, was over and had never been discovered. He had gotten away with it. The investigation that would eventually lead to George Trofimoff's arrest began not in Florida or Germany, but in a KGB archive in Moscow. In 1992, a man named Vasily Mitrokhin, who had served for years as a senior archivist for the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, defected to the United Kingdom. Mitrokhin brought with him something extraordinary: thousands of pages of handwritten notes and classified documents that he had secretly copied over the course of his career. The Mitrokhin archive provided Western intelligence with an unprecedented look into Soviet espionage operations spanning several decades. Among the thousands of pages were records concerning an American intelligence officer codenamed Marquise. The files indicated that Marquise had provided the KGB with classified documents exceeding 50,000 pages taken over 25 years from a NATO interrogation center. Mitrokhin did not have Marquise's real name, but he provided a vague sketch based on the descriptions in the files. A career American intelligence officer whose courier was a Russian Orthodox clergyman. British intelligence shared the Mitrokhin material with their American counterparts. The FBI and Army intelligence began an investigation. The description narrowed the pool of suspects significantly. There were not many American intelligence officers who had spent decades working at a NATO interrogation center with personal connections to Russian Orthodox clergy. The investigation focused on the Nuremberg joint. Interrogation Center. On December 14, 1994, German federal police arrested George Trofimoff and Metropolitan Irene in Germany and interrogated them based on the information from the Mitrokhin archive. During the interrogation, Metropolitan Irene admitted that he had loaned Trofimoff money over the years, claiming it was personal loans to help his foster brother, not payments for espionage. When confronted about KGB connections, the Metropolitan acknowledged that, quote, but denied personally working for Soviet intelligence. Trofimoff also denied espionage, claiming that any money he had received from Metropolitan Irene was personal loans between family members. Both men maintained their innocence, and under German law they could not be prosecuted. Germany's espionage laws contained a statute of limitations of 5 years. Even with evidence of espionage from the 1970s and 1980s, more than 5 years had elapsed. The case could not proceed. Both Trofimoff and Metropolitan Irene were released. Trofimoff returned to Florida. Metropolitan Irene returned to his duties as the Russian Orthodox hierarch of Austria. For Trofimoff, it must have seemed that he had dodged the final bullet. The Germans had arrested him and questioned him, but they had been forced to let him go. American authorities had no jurisdiction over crimes committed in Germany. He was safe. But the United States had no statute of limitations for espionage, and American investigators were not giving up. Metropolitan Irene died in July 1999 at the age of 80. After his death, Patriarch Alexei II of the Russian Orthodox Church sent a telegram praising his service to the church. Trofimoff had expected that his foster brother would leave him money in his will, and he repeatedly told neighbors and acquaintances that the Metropolitan had promised him an inheritance that would have to be sent through church channels because of banking complications. The inheritance never materialized. By 1999, George and Jutta Trofimoff were in serious financial trouble. According to Colonel Andy Byers, who lived in the same gated community in Melbourne and would later write a book about the case, Trofimoff loved to entertain his neighbors with gourmet meals and fine wine, but had expensive tastes and poor financial discipline. Years later, Trofimoff would recall, "We had therefore acquired considerable debts, especially on the so readily available credit cards. I have to admit that I was the person responsible for getting us into this hole. Jutta kept cautioning me, but I just didn't want to listen to reason, and thought to be smart enough to get us out of this dilemma." The Trofimoffs took out a second mortgage on their house, which temporarily relieved the financial burden, but did not solve the underlying problem. When George insisted on buying a new Chrysler automobile despite Jutta's protests that they could not afford it, their debt situation became critical. George Trofimoff, a retired colonel in the United States Army Reserve and former chief of a NATO intelligence facility, was reduced to bagging groceries at a local public supermarket. On July 10, 1997, 2 years before Metropolitan Irene's death, Trofimoff received a telephone call from a man who identified himself as Igor Galkin, an officer with the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. Galkin explained that there had been a problem. A defecting analyst had stolen or destroyed most of Trofimoff's file. In exchange for Trofimoff's assistance in rebuilding the file, Galkin offered financial compensation. The man calling himself Igor Galkin was actually FBI Special Agent Dmitry Druzhinsky. Druzhinsky was a Russian American who had spent his career impersonating KGB operatives to elicit confessions from suspected spies. In 1988, he had successfully obtained a confession from U.S. Army warrant officer James Hall III, who had been spying for both the KGB and the East German Stasi. Druzhinsky's specialty was gaining the trust of suspects by speaking perfect Russian, understanding Russian culture, and presenting himself as a fellow Russian who could help solve their problems. The initial contact in July 1997 led to multiple phone calls over the following months. Druzhinsky was patient. He built rapport. He expressed sympathy for Trofimoff's financial difficulties and hinted at the possibility of financial assistance from Moscow, but explained that it would take time to get approval. Trofimoff was cautious at first, but he was also desperate. In February 1999, nearly 2 years after the initial contact, Trofimoff finally agreed to meet Druzhinsky in person. The meeting took place at a comfort inn near Trofimoff's home in Melbourne. FBI technicians set up recording equipment and a video camera in the adjacent room. Over 6 hours, Druzhinsky and Trofimoff talked, and Trofimoff told him everything. Trofimoff described his job at the Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center and how Metropolitan Irene had recruited him. He described the camera and tripod the KGB had provided for photographing documents and the regular meetings in Austria where he handed over film in exchange for cash. When Druzhinsky asked about the volume of material, Trofimoff said his job had been, quote, 6. He said, quote, 7. At one point during the conversation, Trofimoff placed his hand over his heart and told Druzhinsky, quote, 8. After the meeting in February 1999, Druzhinsky maintained contact but said that getting approval for payment would take time. Months passed. In May 2000, after a silence of 5 months, Druzhinsky called Trofimoff again. When Trofimoff expressed concern that he had been forgotten, Druzhinsky reassured him. Quote, 9. Trofimoff's response was immediate and emotional. "Oh, Igor, you're saving my life. I was ready to put a bullet in my head. Wonderful, I thank you very much." When Trofimoff entered the hotel room on June 14, 2000, Druzhinsky was there with the money, but FBI agents were also there. At approximately 10:30 a.m., George Vladimirovich Trofimoff was placed under arrest. Later that day, the U.S. Attorney's Office unsealed a 32-count federal indictment charging him with conspiracy to commit espionage. When FBI agents informed Yuta Trofimoff that her husband had been arrested for espionage, she was genuinely shocked. Federal prosecutors would later state that Trofimoff's current wife and his previous wives had not known about his KGB activities. He had kept the secret from everyone except the people who needed to know. The espionage trial of George Trofimoff began on June 5, 2001, in federal court in Tampa, Florida. He was 74 years old, a bald, distinguished-looking man who maintained the bearing of a military officer even while facing the most serious charges that could be brought against an American intelligence officer. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense attorney, Daniel Hernandez, argued that the government's case rested almost entirely on statements Trofimoff had made to an undercover FBI agent, statements that Trofimoff now claimed were fabrications designed to make himself appear valuable in order to obtain money he desperately needed. The prosecution's case was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Terry Furr, who told the jury in his opening statement that Trofimoff had become virtually a salaried employee of the KGB. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was 6 hours of videotaped conversations between Trofimoff and FBI agent Drudzinski, in which Trofimoff described his espionage activities in detail, named KGB officers he had worked with, described operational methods, and complained about being underpaid by the KGB. The prosecution called several witnesses who provided context and corroboration. Former U.S. Marine Clayton Lonetree, who had himself been convicted of espionage, testified about KGB recruiting techniques. General William Odom, former director of the National Security Agency, explained the potential damage caused by Trofimoff's betrayal. According to General Odom, while Trofimoff may not have been as damaging as CIA mole Aldrich Ames or FBI mole Robert Hansen, he had still caused significant harm. He could provide to his Soviet handlers a rather clear picture of what we wanted to know, and that in turn allowed them to have a reasonably good sense of what we already knew. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution called Oleg Danilovich Kalugin to the witness stand. Kalugin was a former KGB major general who had been head of foreign counterintelligence for the KGB's first chief directorate during the 1970s. He had overseen operations against the United States and had been one of the youngest generals in KGB history. In the late 1980s and 1990s, Kalugin had become disillusioned with the Soviet system and had eventually defected to the United States. When prosecutors asked Kalugin if he knew the identity of the American intelligence asset, codenamed, quote, Kalugin responded clearly. Kalugin testified that he had personally met with Trofimoff at a location in Austria and that Metropolitan Irene had recruited and handled him. He testified that he had invited the Metropolitan to his dacha in 1978 to thank him for his work, and that Trofimoff had been ranked at the top of the KGB's list of American intelligence assets during the 1970s. When asked about the Order of the Red Banner that Trofimoff had received, Kalugin stated, "After all, he deserved the award for the work he did for us." The defense tried to undermine Kalugin's credibility by pointing to inconsistencies between his court testimony and accounts he had written in his memoirs, but the basic facts remained unchanged. When Trofimoff took the stand in his own defense, he maintained that he had never been a spy. He testified that everything he had told Agent Drudzinski during their videotaped meetings was a fabrication, claiming he had made himself out to be a spy in order to obtain money that he believed was owed to him from Metropolitan Irene's estate through church channels. He testified that he thought Drudzinski represented the Russian Orthodox Church, not Russian intelligence, and that he needed to convince Drudzinski that he was in dire financial straits and had been a valuable asset in order to justify receiving the money. The jury did not find his explanation credible. When prosecutors showed Trofimoff photographs of several Russian intelligence officers and he was able to identify them by name, he claimed it was simply coincidence. Parts of his testimony were so implausible that members of the jury were observed laughing. Mark King, a truck driver from Ruskin who served as jury foreman, would later say, "There were too many things that were the same. He often seemed to be lying. His story did not jibe." After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on the morning of June 26, 2001. Deliberations lasted less than 2 hours. When the jury returned with a verdict, Trofimoff stood at the defense table and pushed his shoulders back, lifting his chin, a posture that resembled a soldier at attention, or perhaps just a man steeling himself to hear his fate. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Trofimoff turned slightly toward his wife, Juta, who lifted her head when the words were read and then lowered it into one hand. Trofimoff gave her an almost imperceptible shrug. It was over. On September 27, 2001, United States District Judge Susan Bucklew sentenced George Trofimoff to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Despite his attorney's plea for leniency based on Trofimoff's age and deteriorating health, the judge determined that the severity of the betrayal and the damage caused to national security warranted the maximum sentence. At 74 years old, Trofimoff became the highest-ranking U.S. military officer ever convicted of espionage. Assistant U.S. Attorney Laura Ingersoll stated after the sentencing, "What this case should do is send a message to those to whom we entrust our nation's secrets, that if you sell those secrets, if you spy against the United States, we will pull out all the stops to catch you, to bring you to justice, and to convict you." Trofimoff was transported to federal prison to begin serving his life sentence. He continued to maintain his innocence, filing multiple appeals, arguing that he had been entrapped, that the evidence was insufficient, and that his age should have been a mitigating factor. All of his appeals were denied. In 2004, Trofimoff's case reached the United States Supreme Court, but the court declined to grant him a hearing, refusing his petition without comment. Through 3 appeals, his conviction and sentence were upheld. Back in Melbourne, Florida, Yuta Trofimoff was left to deal with the aftermath alone. The couple declared bankruptcy not long after George's arrest. Their home on Patriot Drive was lost. Their savings were gone. Yuta, who authorities had confirmed was not involved in her husband's espionage activities, found herself suddenly widowed in all but name, living with the knowledge that the man she had married had kept a secret of staggering proportions from her for decades. The damage assessment conducted by U.S. intelligence agencies after Trofimoff's conviction revealed the scope of the betrayal, though many details remain classified. Trofimoff had provided the KGB with the complete debriefings of Eastern Bloc defectors who had fled to the West seeking protection and asylum. Those defectors had trusted that their identities and testimony would be protected. Instead, their identities, their statements, and their vulnerabilities were handed directly to Soviet intelligence. Some of those defectors may have had family members still living in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. The KGB now knew who had defected, what they had said, and what leverage might exist to pressure them. Trofimoff had also provided NATO order of battle documents, which detailed the organization, strength, and positioning of Western military forces. He had revealed American intelligence collection priorities, showing the Soviets exactly what gaps existed in American knowledge and what questions intelligence officers were trying to answer. This allowed Soviet intelligence to understand not just what the West knew, but what the West was trying to find out, information that could be used to feed disinformation, protect sources, or adjust operational security. Intelligence experts who analyzed the case noted that while Trofimoff had not had access to the most sensitive communications intelligence or human agent identities the way CIA mole Aldrich Ames or FBI mole Robert Hansen had, his position at the Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center had given him access to a comprehensive view of Western intelligence operations against the Soviet Union over the course of 25 years. But perhaps the most significant damage was harder to quantify. Trust is the foundation of intelligence work. Defectors must trust that they will be protected. Allies must trust that shared intelligence will be safeguarded. Officers must trust their colleagues. Trofimoff's betrayal undermined that trust, raised questions about how many other officers might be compromised, forced a reassessment of security procedures at interrogation facilities, and contributed to a climate of suspicion and doubt that persisted long after the Cold War ended. George Vladimirovich Trofimoff spent the final 13 years of his life in federal prison. He was incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary, Victorville, a high-security federal prison in the high desert of Southern California. Prison records indicate he continued to maintain his innocence until the end. He gave interviews to journalists, including a 60-minute segment in 2002, in which he repeated his claim that he had never been a spy and that his videotaped confessions were elaborate lies designed to obtain money from what he believed was the Russian Orthodox Church. On September 19, 2014, Trofimoff died at USP Victorville at the age of 87. He had been in federal custody for 14 years and 3 months. The cause of death was not publicly disclosed, though he had been in declining health. He died maintaining that he was innocent, that he had been falsely convicted, that the American justice system had failed him. Yuta Trofimoff outlived her husband, but the details of her life after his conviction remain largely private. She did not give interviews. She did not write a book. She faded from public view, a secondary victim of her husband's choices. The defectors whose identities Trofimoff had compromised were, in many cases, never publicly identified. The nature of intelligence work is that the victims of espionage are often anonymous, the agents whose covers were blown, the defectors whose families faced consequences, the operations that were compromised before they could succeed. Their stories remain classified, their fates unknown. Metropolitan Irene died in 1999 before Trofimoff's arrest and never faced criminal charges in the United States for his role in the espionage operation. His death was noted by the Russian Orthodox Church with honors and praise for his service. There was no public acknowledgement of his work for the KGB. Oleg Kalugin, the former KGB general who testified against Trofimoff, became a naturalized U.S. citizen on August 4, 2003. In 2002, a Russian court convicted Kalugin in absentia of treason and sentenced him to 15 years in prison for his cooperation with Western intelligence. The verdict came after his testimony in the Trofimoff case. Kalugin remained in the United States, where he worked as a professor and consultant on intelligence matters. FBI agent Dmitry Druzhinsky, who posed as Igor Galkin and elicited Trofimoff's videotaped confession, continued his career in counterintelligence. In a 2016 article in Smithsonian Magazine, Druzhinsky described the Trofimoff case as one of his most significant operations, recalling the patience required to gain Trofimoff's trust and the months of careful telephone conversations. The operation had worked exactly as designed. The question of responsibility in cases like this operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There is individual responsibility. Trofimoff made a choice to betray classified information in exchange for money, and that choice had consequences. There is institutional responsibility. The security system at the Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center relied on trust rather than rigorous physical controls, which made the theft possible. There is systemic responsibility. The penetration of the Russian Orthodox Church by the KGB created a network of intelligence operatives operating under religious cover, using personal relationships and spiritual authority to recruit agents. Trofimoff himself never accepted responsibility for espionage. His defense, both at trial and for the rest of his life, was that he had fabricated the entire story to obtain money. This explanation required the jury to believe that he had, by pure coincidence, fabricated a detailed espionage narrative that exactly matched classified KGB records in the Mitrokhin archive, that he had correctly identified multiple KGB officers by name from photographs despite claiming he had never met them, and that his fabricated story aligned perfectly with the testimony of a former KGB general who had no reason to falsely implicate him. The jury found this implausible, and every appeals court that reviewed the case agreed. But even accepting Trofimoff's guilt, the question of why he did it remains more complicated. The prosecution argued that he was motivated primarily by greed. He lived beyond his means, went through 5 wives, bought expensive cars, and needed money to sustain that lifestyle. The KGB offered him money, and he took it. This explanation is consistent with his financial history and his desperate circumstances when the FBI contacted him. Yet greed alone does not fully explain why someone would commit espionage for 25 years. Trofimoff himself, in his videotaped conversations with Agent Drujinski, placed his hand over his heart and said, "I'm not American in here." This suggests that identity played a role. He was born in Berlin to Russian parents, raised by white Russian émigrés, and spoke Russian as a native speaker. When Metropolitan Irene approached him, it was not just a KGB handler recruiting an asset. It was his foster brother, the person who had raised him when his father could not, asking for his help. The complexity deepens when considering that Trofimoff's family had been victims of Soviet communism. His grandfather was executed by the Cheka. His family lost everything in the revolution. He fled Soviet forces at the end of World War II and came to America specifically to escape communist control. And yet he spent 25 years helping Soviet intelligence. Perhaps this can be understood by recognizing that people are capable of holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously, that family loyalty can override political ideology, that resentment toward one's adopted country can coexist with hatred of the country one is helping, that betrayal and self-interest can masquerade as complex moral reasoning. The institutional failures were also significant. The security system at the Nuremberg Joint Interrogation Center was based on trust and clearance levels, not on rigorous physical controls over the movement of classified documents. This was not unusual for the time. Many intelligence facilities operated on the assumption that cleared personnel could be trusted. But Trofimoff demonstrated that this assumption was dangerous. The fact that he was able to remove documents, photograph them at home, return them the next day, and repeat this process for years without detection suggests systemic vulnerabilities that extended beyond his individual betrayal. The role of the Russian Orthodox Church in Soviet intelligence operations has been extensively documented by historians and defectors. The Moscow Patriarchate during the Cold War was deeply compromised. Not every clergyman was a KGB operative, but the upper hierarchy was carefully controlled. Bishops and metropolitans who wanted to rise in the church had to be approved by Soviet authorities, and that approval often came with expectations of cooperation. Metropolitan Irene was not an aberration. He was part of a system in which religious institutions were used as covers for intelligence operations. George Trofimoff was 42 years old when he began spying for the KGB. He was 67 when he stopped. He was 73 when he was arrested. He was 87 when he died. In between, he lived a life of deception that spanned decades, maintained secrets that destroyed trust, and made choices that harmed people he never met. The damage he caused cannot be precisely quantified because much of it remains classified. We know he provided 50,000 pages of documents that included defector testimony, order of battle information, and intelligence priorities. We know the Soviets considered him valuable enough to award him their highest military decoration. But we do not know the names of all the defectors he compromised, or what happened to them, or what operations were damaged, or how many lives were affected. What we do know is that trust, once broken in intelligence work, is nearly impossible to fully restore. After Trofimoff's arrest, security procedures at similar facilities were reviewed and strengthened. Access controls were tightened. The assumption that cleared personnel could be trusted without additional safeguards was questioned. These changes came too late to prevent Trofimoff's betrayal, but they may have prevented others. The human cost extends beyond the immediate victims. Yuta Trofimoff discovered that her husband had been living a lie for longer than she had known him. Trofimoff's colleagues and friends had to reconsider everything they thought they knew about him. American defectors from the Soviet Union who had been debriefed at the Nuremberg Center had to wonder whether their testimony had been compromised, whether they were safe, whether coming to the West had been worth it. And then there are the unknowable victims, the agents who were never recruited because the Soviets knew what the Americans were looking for, the defectors who never fled because they learned the interrogation center was compromised, the intelligence operations that were adjusted or canceled because Soviet handlers understood what the West knew. These counterfactuals cannot be measured, but they are real nonetheless. Trofimoff spent his final years in a high-security federal prison in the California desert, thousands of miles from Germany, where he had committed his crimes, thousands of miles from Florida, where he had been arrested, thousands of miles from any life he had known. Whether his claim of innocence was genuine belief or strategic narrative is impossible to determine. Perhaps at some point, after repeating the same story for years, he had convinced himself it was true. Or perhaps he knew exactly what he had done and simply refused to admit it. Either way, he took his secrets to his grave. The history of Cold War espionage is filled with individuals who betrayed their countries for money, ideology, love, revenge, or reasons they themselves may not have fully understood. Aldrich Ames sold CIA secrets to the Soviets for cash and caused the deaths of at least 10 American agents. Robert Hanssen sold FBI secrets for 22 years and was never adequately able to explain why. John Walker, Jr. sold Navy cryptographic material and compromised American communications for nearly 2 decades. George Trofimoff sold interrogation center documents and defector identities and intelligence priorities for 25 years. The question is not whether these cases were exceptional. They were not. The question is what they tell us about the vulnerabilities inherent in any system that relies on human beings to protect secrets. Perfect security is impossible because people are not perfect. They have financial pressures, ideological commitments, personal relationships, psychological vulnerabilities, and moral blind spots. Some of them will betray the trust placed in them. Security systems can make betrayal harder, but they cannot make it impossible. The best defense is vigilance, combined with the recognition that the threat is perpetual and comes from within as much as from without. George Trofimoff was carrying a briefcase to meet someone he believed would give him $20,000 when he was arrested at age 73. He died at age 87 in a federal prison, still claiming he had been wrongfully convicted. In between, he served 14 years behind bars, lost everything he had accumulated, and became a footnote in the history of American espionage, not as notable as Ames or Hanssen, but significant enough to earn the distinction of being the highest-ranking U.S. military officer ever convicted of selling secrets to a foreign power. His wife lost her home and her husband. His legacy became betrayal. His foster brother, who recruited him, died honored by the church. The defectors he compromised remain mostly anonymous. The system that enabled his crimes was reformed but not perfected. And the secrets he protected, his own guilt, his motivations, his true beliefs, went with him when he died. That is espionage, stripped of its romance and mythology. It is not glamorous or heroic. It is a grocery bagger desperate for cash, meeting a fake Russian agent in a Tampa hotel room, getting arrested on a Wednesday morning in June, and spending the rest of his life in prison, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. It is a wife discovering her husband was a spy. It is defectors wondering if they are safe. It is documents photographed with a special camera and handed over in Vienna. It is 25 years of betrayal for money that never lasted. It is a military decoration from a government that no longer exists, awarded for work that destroyed trust between people who should have been able to depend on each other. Trofimoff died believing, or at least claiming, he was innocent. The jury believed otherwise. The evidence supported their conclusion. The appeals courts agreed. History will remember him as guilty, whether he accepted that verdict or not.